I have buried a wife, 2 good horses, and the better part of my own hard heart in the high snow of the Wapiti Range. So when I tell you a storm can come round like a wheel and change a man's whole life inside of one night, you can take it as the truth of someone who watched it happen. It was the winter I turned 40, the year of the great Christmas storm, and I will tell it the way I remember it, which is the only way I have. I was out past the river bend when the sky went the color of a dead fire. I had 11 head of cattle and a half-broke bay gelding I'd no business riding in that country alone, and I had told myself I'd bring the stock down off the bench before the weather turned. The weather did not wait for me. The wind came first, out of the north, a low animal sound that I felt in my back teeth before I heard it, and then the snow came down sideways the way it does when the storm means business, and the light went out of the world like somebody had thrown a coat over it. A man who has lived alone long enough talks to himself. I said out loud, "You old fool," and turned the bay for home, and the bay didn't want to go and I made him. I have seen hard weather. I was born into it, but I had never in my life seen the wind do what it did that afternoon, which was to gather itself up into a turning thing, a great gray wheel of snow and grit that walked across the open flat with a roar like a train coming through a canyon. I sat the horse and watched it the way you'd watch a bear stand up. It tore the top off a haystack a half-mile off and threw it into the sky. It bent the lone cottonwood by the ford clear over and held it there. I have heard old men in Cobb's Ford call it a snow cyclone, and I have heard them call it the devil's wheel. And I don't know the right word, only that it came down out of that sky like the end of something, and I put my heels to the bay and ran. I would have ridden straight past her if the bay hadn't shied. There was a wagon on its side near the wash, a freight wagon, the canvas gone, the team cut loose and bolted or dead, and a horse down in the traces with its neck wrong, and beside the wagon, in the lee of the upturned bed, a heap of dark wool that I took for a fallen tarp until it moved. I got down. The wind near put me on my face. I went to the heap of wool and turned it over, and it was a woman, and she was alive, and she looked up at me out of a face gone the gray-white of a winter sky and said, very clearly, as if we had met at a church social, "There's a man under the wagon. See to him first." I want you to understand what that did to me, even then, with the cold coming for both of us. She was nearer dead than I have ever seen a person be and still talk, her lips the color of a bruise, her eyelashes frozen, and the first thing out of her was to send me to somebody else. There was no man under the wagon. There was a strong box and a busted crate of dry goods and a leather bag she'd been lying half across. But she was sure of it, the way the freezing gets sure of things, and I let her be sure and told her I'd found him and he was fine, because a lie was kinder than the cold just then, and I got my arm under her and got her up, and she could not stand. Her legs were gone from under her. I took the bag because her hand would not let go of it, and I got her across the bay's withers, and I climbed up behind, and I prayed to a God I had quit speaking to that the wheel of the storm would not come back across our line. It did not. It went on east, roaring, and left the plain ordinary white and killing behind it, and I rode the 4 miles to the 3 Larches with a dying stranger across my saddle, and the snow filling up our tracks behind us as fast as we made them. My place sat in a fold of the hills where 3 old larch trees stood up out of the snow like the masts of a sunk ship. The cabin was log, low and tight, the work of my own hands and my late wife's plans, and I had not had another soul under its roof in better than 6 years. I kicked the door and carried her in and laid her by the hearth and built the fire up till the chimney roared, and then I did all the things you do. I got the wet wool off her, careful as I could and with my eyes where they ought to be, and I wrapped her in every blanket I owned and in the bearskin off my own bed, and I put hot stones from the hearth at her feet and her sides, and I held her hands in mine and rubbed the life back into them, and the whole time she drifted in and out and asked me, twice more, if I had seen to the man. "He's by the fire," I told her, "same as you." Sometime in the black middle of the night her shivering, which had stopped, and a man who knows the cold knows that stopping is the thing to fear. Her shivering started up again, hard, her teeth going like a telegraph key, and I have never in my life been so glad to watch a person suffer, because it meant her body had decided to fight. Toward dawn she slept a true sleep, color coming back into her face by inches, and I sat against the wall with my rifle across my knees out of pure habit and watched her breathe and did not sleep at all. She woke when the light was gray in the one window. She looked at the rafters, and at the fire, and last of all at me, and her eyes were the clear brown of creek water over stones, and there was nothing soft in them. They took my measure the way I'd take the measure of a horse I meant to buy. "You're not a man who keeps company," she said. Her voice was a rasp. "There's no second cup on that shelf, no curtain, one chair." She looked at me steady. "Did I dream a man under the wagon, or did you lie to me?" "I have been called many things in my life, but never quick," I said. "There wasn't any man." She closed her eyes. "His name was Harlan Pace. He was the teamster. He went off the box when the wind took us." She said it flat, the way you report a thing you cannot afford to feel yet. "He's dead then." "If he went off the box in that, he is." She nodded once, and that was all the grieving she let me see, and I understood her a little better for it. We were two of a kind in that, holding our dead off at arm's length so we could keep standing. Her name was Tamsin Coyle. She had been 3 days out of the railhead, riding the freight up to the camps above Cobb's Ford because the doctor down at the railhead had a bottle for a master, and the camps had the diphtheria coming through the children, and she meant to get there before it took the worst of them. She was a healer. Not a doctor with papers, she was careful to say, a granny woman's granddaughter, raised on it, with a bag of her own roots and tinctures and a steel nerve, and a pair of hands that had pulled more bobbies into the world and more fevers out of it than the railhead doctor had ever dreamed of. She told me this lying flat on my floor wrapped in a bearskin, and there was not 1 ounce of boasting in it. It was a stock-taking. She was telling herself, as much as me, what was still in her keeping after the storm had taken the rest. "The camps," she said. "How far?" 20 miles, up through Dutchman's Pass." "How soon can a man get through?" I went to the window. The snow was to the sill. Beyond the larches the world was a white nothing, no line between the ground and the sky. "Nobody's getting through that pass before April," I said. "Maybe not then." She was quiet a long while. Then she said, "Those children," and her voice cracked clean across the middle for the first time, and she turned her face to the fire so I would not see it, and I let her have that the way she'd let me have mine. I want to tell you that I was kind to her from the first, but it would not be the truth. The truth is that I had lived alone so long I'd forgotten the shape another person makes in a room, and her being there rubbed me wrong as a stone in a boot. I was short with her. I gave her the bed and took the floor and made it plain by my silence that I considered the whole business an inconvenience the weather had handed me, and that I'd hand her right back the minute it let up. I am not proud of it. A man builds a wall high enough, long enough, and he forgets it's a wall. He thinks it's just the edge of the world. She gave me back exactly what I gave her, which I came to respect. She did not weep and cling and thank me through her tears the way I'd half feared a rescued woman might. By the second day she was up, unsteady but up, going through my poor kitchen with a frown, taking inventory of my flour and my beans and my smoked elk and my one sad onion. By the third she had taken over the cooking without asking and without apology, because, she said, a man who could let good elk get that tough had no business being trusted with it. And she was right. And the supper she made of the same stores I'd been ruining for years near brought tears to my eyes for reasons that had nothing to do with the onion. The storm did not let up. That was the thing none of us reckoned on. The great wheel had only been the front of it. For 2 weeks the snow came and came, easing and then coming again, the wind packing it up against the north wall of the cabin till the one window went dark and I had to dig the door clear every morning just to get to the barn. There was no question of her leaving. There was no question of anything but the next armload of wood. The next hole melted in the ice on the trough, the slow accounting of how long the stores would last 2 mouths instead of 1. We were, the both of us, snowed in together as tight as 2 seeds in a pod, and there was nothing for it but to learn to share the air. We learned it slow. It was the foal that started the thaw, if I'm honest, and not anything either of us did on purpose. I had a mare in the barn, a good little roan named Juniper that my wife had loved, and Juniper had thrown a late foal that fall, a leggy filly I'd not yet named, and on about the 10th night of the snow the filly went down. I came in from the barn with my face like a grave, and Tamsin looked up from the fire and said, "What's wrong with the animal?" I had not told her there was a sick animal, but she'd read it off me the way she read everything, off the second cup that wasn't there and the lie about the man, and now off my own dead face. "Foal's colicked," I said. "Gone down, I've seen it before, there's nothing for it." She was up and into her boots and her shawl before I'd got the words out. "Show me." "It's 20 below in that barn, and you near died 10 days ago." "Show me the animal, Mr. Renner." I showed her the animal. She knelt down in the straw beside that filly in the lantern light. This woman who'd been a frozen heap of wool on the open range not 2 weeks before, and she put her hands on its belly and her ear against its side, and she was quiet a long time, and then she started in to work. I will not pretend I understood the half of it, the warm mash she had me make, the way she walked that filly up and down the freezing barn for hours when every bone in me said let it lie, the foul-smelling tincture out of her bag, the long patient massage of its sides with hands that must have been past feeling. I held the lantern. I did what she told me. Somewhere in the small black hours, the filly passed what was binding her up and heaved herself to her feet and stood there trembling and alive, and Tamsin sat back in the straw with her hair come loose, and her face gray with cold and tiredness, and she laughed. It was the first I'd heard her laugh. It was a low, surprised, used-up sound, the laugh of a person who has spent everything and won anyway, and it went through the wall I'd built straight to the place behind it I had supposed was empty, and found it was not empty after all. "What'll you call her?" she said, nodding at the filly. I hadn't meant to name it. Naming a thing is letting it matter. I looked at the filly and at the woman, and I heard myself say, "Christmas, seeing as it's near." "It's a fine name," Tamsin said, and something passed between us in that frozen barn that I did not have a wall built against, because I had never thought I would need one. After that the cabin was a different place. Not all at once, we were neither of us built for all at once, but I quit taking the floor and built her a proper cot in the corner and hung a blanket on a line for her privacy, and felt foolish I hadn't done it the first day. I started talking. I had not known how much talk a man dams up in 6 years, until it started coming out of me of an evening, the fire low and the snow ticking at the window, and Tamsin mending by the light or grinding her roots in a little bowl, and the two of us trading our lives back and forth a piece at a time the way you do when there's nothing in the world to do but wait out the weather. She'd been married once, young, to a man who turned out hollow, who left her in a railhead town with a name to live down and a trade to live on, and she had built a life out of being needed by people who did not always thank her for it. She'd learned not to lean. She'd learned not to want a home, because wanting was just another way the world had of getting its hooks in you. I knew the shape of that the way you know your own hand. I told her about Sarah. I had not said my wife's name out loud in years. I told her how Sarah and I had built the 3 larches with our own backs, and how she'd taken the fever the second winter, and the baby coming had taken her the rest of the way, and how I'd buried them both under the larches in ground I had to thaw with a fire to dig, and how after that I had simply stopped. Not died. Stopped. Kept the stock alive and the roof tight, and went into the town twice a year for what I couldn't make or shoot, and let the rest of the world go on without me on the far side of a wall I told myself was just the edge of things. Tamsin listened the way she did everything. All the way down, When I'd finished, she didn't tell me it wasn't my fault, which I'd have hated, and she didn't tell me Sarah would want me to be happy, which I'd have hated worse. She said, "You kept the trees." She meant the larches. A man who'd really quit would have let the trees go. You watered them through the dry years, I'd guess. You've been keeping them for somebody. You just didn't know who yet. I didn't have an answer to that. I have turned it over in my mind for 40 years since, and I still don't, except that she was right. Christmas came on us in the middle of all that snow. We had not planned to mark it. There was nothing to mark it with. But the morning of it, the wind had quit for the first time in weeks, and the sun came up hard and bright on a world of new snow that hurt to look at, and Tamsin stood in the open door breathing the clean cold and said, soft, "It's Christmas, Eli." It was the first she'd used my given name. I went out into the still cold, and I cut a little spruce from the draw below the larches, no taller than my arm, and stood it in a crock by the fire. And Tamsin went into her bag of healer's things and brought out a length of red wool yarn she used for tying her bundles, and we wound it round the little tree, and she hummed a hymn I half remembered, and that was all of it, and it was the finest Christmas I had had since I was a boy. I had been carving, those long nights in secret, the way a man does a thing he's ashamed to want. I'd made her a comb, out of a piece of elk antler with a vine cut along the spine of it, because I'd seen her struggle her hair into order of a morning with her fingers. I gave it to her wrapped in a clean square of flour sacking and could not look at her while she opened it. When she had it open, she was quiet so long I was certain I'd done a foolish thing, and then I made myself look, and she was not displeased. She was the other thing. She put it in her hair and looked at me and said, "Nobody's made me anything since my grandmother died." And I understood that we had both, without meaning to, without a word spoken about it, started building something in that Snowden cabin that neither of us had let ourselves want in years. She gave me a thing too. She'd taken my Sarah's old shawl that I'd kept folded in the chest and could not bear to look at, and without asking she had unpicked the moth-eaten places and reworked them with her red yarn, mending it instead of throwing it out, making it whole again and something new at once, and she put it in my hands and said, "A thing can be kept and still be used, Eli. It doesn't dishonor the dead to keep living." And I had to go out and split what I did not need, so she would not see what her gift had done to me. I have told you the slow part. Now I will tell you the hard part, because they don't come without each other, the slow and the hard, not in this country and not in this life. In the last week of that long winter, when the snow had begun to rot at the edges, and we had let ourselves believe the worst was behind, the worst came back. It started with a sound in the night, far off and wrong, a long, low cry carried on a wind that had got up out of the south, warm and wet, the kind of wind that in the high country means trouble worse than cold. I was up and at the window. There was lightning in the south, in January, which is a thing that should not be, and the warm wind was eating the snowpack so fast you could hear it, a great whispering hiss off the whole white country, and far down the slope toward the ashlar I could see the dark line of the river coming up out of its banks where the ice had jammed. The cry came again, and this time we both knew it for what it was, a child, down toward the river. "The Okerlund place," I said, "the only place between us and the water. A homesteading family, a husband off to the railhead for the winter work, a wife alone with 3 young ones in a soddy too near the river, and I had not thought of them in weeks, God forgive me, snowed up in my own happiness." "How far?" Tamsin said, already pulling on her boots. "A mile, maybe less." "Then we've no time to argue about whether I'm coming." We did not argue. We went out into a night that had turned to thaw and lightning and rising water, the worst footing I have ever crossed, the snow gone to bottomless slush, the warm wind tearing at us, and we made that mile in the dark by the lightning and by the child's crying, which led us in like a bell. We found the soddy with the river already at its door, the muddy water sucking at the threshold, and inside Mrs. Okerlund half out of her mind and burning up with the same diphtheria fever that had been working through the camps, and the baby sick with it too, and the 2 older children, a boy and a girl, the ones who'd been crying, standing in the rising water trying to drag their mother to higher ground and not strong enough to do it. I am a big man, and I was no use at all next to what Tamsin Coyle did that night. She took that house in hand the way she'd taken my kitchen. She had me carry the mother and the baby up the slope to the lee of a stand of rock, out of the water's reach, and she sent the boy back for blankets while the girl held the lantern, and she went to work on the baby's throat with her steady frozen hands and her tinctures and a hollow goose quill she carried for exactly this. And she did a thing I will not describe to you in full because it would turn your stomach, but it opened a passage in that baby's throat. The membrane was closing, and the baby breathed. A long whooping breath, and lived. Then she did the same for the mother. All this in the dark, in the wet, with the river coming up the slope behind us inch by inch and me hauling the family's few goods, and then the family's stock, and then standing between the lot of them and the black water with no more notion of how to stop a flood than a child. The water came up to within a yard of where we'd put the mother and stopped. Some jam broke loose downriver and the ashlar dropped as fast as it had risen, and the gray dawn found the 5 of them alive, 6, with the baby and Tamsin sitting in the mud with the smallest one against her chest, gray to the lips, spent down to nothing, exactly as I'd found her the day of the storm. I knelt down by her in that mud, and I took her face in my 2 hands, which I had no right to do and did not ask leave for, and I said the thing I'd been keeping behind the wall for weeks, which came out plainer and rougher than I meant. I'm not letting you go up to those camps to die in some soddy, I said, or anywhere else. I've buried everyone I won't. Stay at the 3 Larches, stay with me. She looked up at me out of that gray, spent, beautiful face, and even then, even spent to the bone, she did not just fall into it the way a weaker woman might. She was Tamsin Coyle to the last. She said, "Those camps still need somebody, Eli. Then we'll go to the camps together come the thaw and you'll doctor them and I'll dig the graves and chop the wood and then we'll come home. But you'll have a home to come back to. I'm done living behind a wall." My voice gave out on me. "Marry me, not because the storm threw you at my door, because I'd choose you in fair weather and have, every day since the foal. And here is the part I have carried warm in my chest for 40 years. She did not say yes right off. She looked a long time at the gray water and the rescued family, and the sun coming up red over the drowned country, taking her own measure the way she'd taken mine that first morning by the fire. And then she reached up with one mud-caked hand and touched the elk-antler comb still in her hair that she'd worn through the flood and never lost, and she said, "I'll choose you in fair weather too, Eli Renner. I have been. I just didn't have a place to say it." And she said yes. We were married in Cobb's Ford that spring by a circuit preacher, with the whole valley turned out, the Okerlund children throwing the first wildflowers up the church steps, the baby she'd saved fat and well in its mother's arms. We went up to the camps together come summer, and she pulled 6 children back from the diphtheria and lost 2, and grieved the 2 the way she grieved everything, all the way down and then standing up again. And I dug what graves there were and held the lantern and learned, late in my life, how to be of use to somebody. We came home to the 3 Larches, and we made it a place a person could come back to. There were children in time, 3 of them, raised under the larch trees that I'd watered through the dry years for somebody I hadn't met yet. The filly Christmas grew into the best cow horse in the Wapiti country, and she's buried up under the trees now too, near Sarah, who I came to be able to speak of easy and warm, the way Tamsin taught me, a thing kept and still honored and still part of the living family by the fire. Tamsin went gray and then white. The comb wore smooth from 40 years of her hair. She doctored that whole high country to the end of her days, and they buried her with more weeping than the valley had ever done for anybody. And I stood at her grave under the larches with our grown children and their children around me, an old man now, the snow just beginning, and I'll tell you what I thought. I thought about a wheel of snow walking across an open flat with a roar like the end of the world, and a heap of dark wool by an upturned wagon that turned out to be the whole rest of my life. I thought a man builds a wall and calls it the edge of the world, and how it takes a storm sometimes, the worst storm in 40 years, to tear it down and show him there was a country on the other side all along, with a fire in it, and a woman by the fire who'd been looking for a place to come home to the same as he had. Folks in Cobb's Ford still call it the year of the great Christmas storm, and they say it like it was a calamity, the worst weather the valley ever knew. I let them, but I have never once in 40 years called it that in my own heart. I called it the year the door opened. And I never let the winter take her, nor she me, and that fire she reached half frozen on the worst night of my life has not gone out yet, and I do not mean to let it.